Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back at MacGill. I did take a look at the contribution I made last year when I admitted I wasn't overly optimistic about the political prospects for the year ahead, but I have to confess I hadn't been quite so hopeless about what might come upon us. Over the last week, I've been on holiday in Connemara, where I spent my early years, and while procrastinating, instead of doing a contribution for this event, I was reading James Joyce's Dubliners. It's a collection of short stories published in 1914, chronicling life in the capital at the turn of the century. And it was a life of Dublin exhausted. It had lost its way after the fall of Parnell. Economically stagnant, frustrated at the thwarting of Home Rule, the nascent rise of nationalism and separatism, and conveying overall a real sense of paralysis and ennui at about the whole fate of society being in the hands of other people. And I must say it prefigures the situation in Northern Ireland very much at the moment, where it feels like the near collapse of the Good Friday institutions, the looming probability of Brexit, and all of the decisions about our future are being made elsewhere, in Brussels and in Dublin, and most worryingly in London. And I think a major feature of the last couple of generations in Northern Irish politics has been that willingness to not take decisions, and for the political class that not taking hard decisions has in fact been rewarded by an electorate who in many cases feel hopeless and frustrated. And the parties who've had the upper hand over the last decade have spent more time flexing their nationalisms. Paul spoke about a failed society. We have had a failing political infrastructure, and it's worth saying that neither of them have added much onto their tally. The pool of nationalism hasn't grown, nor has the pool of unionism. So really, the 10 years of just dividing up the spoils hasn't really delivered very much for either, for their overall political project. I know this morning our topic is North-South relationships, but I do want to, North-South development, I want to locate my comments within Hume's three-strand approach, because I think, kind of undervalued though it's been, it's the best framework that we have, and it's very clear to me that you won't have progress in one unless you have progress in all of them. It's worth saying as well, even in the years in the recent past in Northern Ireland where we've had stability, we've had little or no development of North-South. The institutions that were very hard fought for in the 1998 negotiations, and indeed decades before in Sunningdale, haven't really been used to any great effect. So to me, calling now for the border poll, notwithstanding the impetus of Brexit, is premature, and it's asking for the scaffolding to go down before the walls are built. And despite some advances having been made in, for example, health and education, there's quite a lot of low-hanging fruit that hasn't been pursued, and it feels like a forlorn hope that we have the backstop. But in a scenario like that, it would be the obvious ground on which to develop an all-island approach to, for example, foreign direct investment. If you look at skills, demand in the Republic of Ireland for things like IT is almost at capacity, so it makes perfect sense to sell the North for projects like that and to build the infrastructure to match. I must say that in setting the tone for North-South relationships, I think nationalism, and I speak as somebody who identifies as a nationalist, we're really self-limiting by always speaking about Irish unity as some sort of righting of an historic wrong and failing to create the conditions, and as Paul referred to, making Northern Ireland work, where Northern Ireland would be at least a plausible proposition for the Republic to take on. Many in the South, I think, have what Diarmaid Ferriter referred to as a rhetorical empathy for closer relationships with the North. But while we only project hostility and dysfunction and cost, and while we only ever speak about how we do Irish unity and not why we do Irish unity, while we only just repeat over and over again that change is inevitable, and while the narrative is always about struggling nationalism and defensive unionism, my fear is that that empathy will remain rhetorical for many more years to come. Instead, we have to articulate a positive, progressive alternative to the status quo, and what a new Ireland might look like and what it might deliver in real terms for all of us and our families in the North and in the South. And certainly for those of my political persuasion, it's how we articulate state, how a social democratic state can deliver more for people in Northern Ireland than being a region of the United Kingdom, where we are almost always at the bottom of all the tables of social and economic well-being. But we haven't done that yet. The border poll should be the last piece of the jigsaw and not the first. You don't have the poll and then build the structures out around it. That's not to say that the dynamic hasn't changed. It absolutely has, because of Brexit. And I must say, of the fairly moderate nationalist tradition that I come from, that conversation is absolutely being had. People are saying Brexit is taking us to ground zero in constitutional terms, and that it makes a lot of sense to build up on a north-south basis. And many people will now see Irish unity as a way to get the hands of people like Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg off your life. And that's a very compelling future, I think. So that instinct as well, that many to work within Northern Ireland to not upset the apple cart, I suppose, while we were rebuilding, when there's such turbulence all around us, that argument has gone. But to put the foot hard on the pedal for reunification as a direct consequence of Brexit is at risk of repeating the profound mistake of the last century, and where we might have another unhappy minority trapped in a region they don't want to be in. Our modern and pluralist new state is not going to be built on slipping a majority past in a period of chaos. The academic Mary Murphy in Cork, who writes extensively about the EU and Northern Ireland, points to the need for support across both traditions for major constitutional change. And she said 1998 had it, Brexit does not, and neither does Irish unity at this time. Seamus Mallon's latest book, which I must say brought me to mind of the Eames Bradley report, in that there's so much decent depth of stuff, but it's always characterised by just one figures-based thing that people have pulled out of it. But it contains so much technical and moral argument for a slower building of Irish unity. And I think the response that he got, including from people within nationalism, just shows the creativity and the generosity deficit that we still have in this debate. Paul referred to the New Ireland Forum, and I must say my hoarder father, when I mentioned it a couple of months ago, he gave me 2 pristine copies of the proceedings and the reports, and I've been amazed by the depth of information on things like legal systems and agriculture and so on that was contained within it. And though a lot of that has been overtaken by EU participation, it does show how much is possible when the conversation is structured and invested in, although I must say I have great sympathy for the argument that this current Irish government, who I think have been very responsive to Northern Ireland, can't risk crossing the wires of Brexit and Irish unity at this time, and it points to why we need to restore the Good Friday institution so that we can convene that forum in a place where we have trust and credibility, and at a time when its outcomes would have authority, and where it would limit the excuses of those who don't wish to engage in it. Richard Humphreys builds on some of the ideas that came out of the New Ireland Forum about the constitutional arrangements, and of course people like Garrett Fitzgerald and John Hume argued that it wouldn't necessarily have to be a unitary state, and Richard Humphreys' book kind of builds on that, and in fact in Beyond the Border he argues that legally institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, including the Assembly but also potentially including the PSNI, there isn't actually legal provision for them to be abolished unless that was a binding change meant for the treaty. But at least, he says, and others say, we must make very clear to unionism that all of the protections that nationalists currently enjoy would apply to unionists in a new Ireland. We also have to looking at East-West relationships, another strand, we have to be realistic about the state that they're in, and if the nervous breakdown of Brexit continues, we have to be very cognizant of the capacity that the UK will have, or the willingness they will have to engage in the type of meaningful conversations and the technical conversations we'll need to have about things like pension contributions and continuing citizenship rights. history has shown us over the last 30 and 40 years in Northern Ireland, for solutions to really have the buy-in of both communities, both governments need to be cooperating as equals and as friends. It took a good 20 years to get to the Good Friday Agreement of deep engagement, and handing Northern Ireland over isn't going to be some sort of Hong Kong situation where there's an agreed date and a neat ceremonial handing over of the flag at all, but we have to want to do it or try to do it at a time when the UK government is going to be there to participate. Moving then to relations within Northern Ireland, the Northern poet John Hewitt called on all of us Northerners to make amends by fraternising, by small friendly gestures, hoping by patient words I may convince my people and this people that we're changed, if not kin to cohabitants. As goat and ox graze in the same field and each gain something from proximity. And I think that's the task that we haven't got on with. That's the task the Good Friday Agreement set out for us. It is reconciliation. Sometimes it's tedious, sometimes it's frustrating, but whatever happens, the goat and the ox in Northern Ireland will still be grazing in that same field. And it's not rocket science, but we can't do better north-south relationships until we do better relationships within Northern Ireland. And I think whatever optimism and possibilities those of us who believe in Irish unity have, we need to be very clear that we have not checked out of the Strand 1 relationships, that we aren't just moving on to the next stage. We need a functioning executive to drive the functioning North-South Ministerial Council, and I believe pulling down those structures without any way of knowing how you're going to put them up was every bit as injurious to the Good Friday Agreement as some of the rights suppressions and the Brexit manoeuvres of the DUP and the UK government. The 2-year stalemate is causing polarisation in real time in Northern Ireland. Unionism and nationalism are caricaturing each other and misunderstanding each other like never before. And I think things like a shared identity that was organically growing over the last 20 years, maybe a Northern Irish identity that for some people was a subset of being Irish, for some people was being a subset of being British, but it was pride in what we shared, and I think that is being torn down and attacked by a lot of people. I've been told myself that it's partitionist, and I say to people, if it's partitionist to have a regional identity, have you ever met anybody from Cork? It's totally natural to have that shared sense of identity and place. We've had the last week people arguing viciously online about whether Rory McIlroy is British or Irish, when that's a decision for him to make, although I was glad to see we did get a beautiful example of North-South cooperation with Bo Martin from Ardglass and Shane Lowry from Offaly producing such a brilliant result. But for political leaders in the North, for many, vision hasn't extended beyond that separate but equal that will keep them in power. And certainly no role is envisaged for the growing numbers of people who don't primarily identify as nationalist or unionist. And that's coming on 20% of the electorate now. And in many cases, they will have a strong view, or a view at least, on the Constitution, but they don't wish to be defined by it. We also need to remember, and as I mentioned at the start, nationalism hasn't put on any numbers, unionism hasn't put on any numbers. Those others in the middle are going to be the deciding factor in any poll whenever it happens. But we haven't evolved the structures to capture their votes, and actually doing so would help break us out of this cycle where DUP and Sinn Féin intransigence feeds the other. Each vote for one has an equal and opposite reaction for the other. And if and when we get back into the Assembly, if we're writing out 20% of people who reside in the other box, we're not going to help. Compounding that is our system for forming government. It offers no incentive for compromise and no real need for shared purpose. Really, the system fills the seats around the table and does very little more. And in fact, the institutions have developed in a way that inadvertently incentivises intransigence and division, and it doesn't lend itself to that project of making Northern Ireland work. In the necessary conversation about fine-tuning those arrangements, I also believe we should find a mechanism to establish when is the right time to form a border poll, because at the moment we know that a local election or an Assembly election or a Westminster election doesn't move the border an inch in either direction, but you wouldn't know that from looking at the lampposts when various parties use that as a campaigning platform, and potentially something like a census-based question would allow a measurement of that allows people to vote on other issues as well. I worry, actually, that even the conversation that we want unionists to be part of the conversation. Even that is a little bit patronising, and I say that because a unionist MLA who I'm very friendly with, and I was ribbing him about not coming down to an event, I think it was the Taoiseach's Forum, and he said to me, if I invited you to an event to discuss, the next century of the Union, would you be jumping at the chance? And I have to be honest that I wouldn't, and we can't dismiss unionism. We can't just speak only to those who agree with our point of view. And in fact, I was looking at the Ulster Hall is in my South Belfast constituency, and it was there that an increasingly ill Charles Stewart Parnell, who had been deposed as leader of the Parliamentary Party in May 1891, harried on at bay, and he died 5 months later. But what he said in that speech still has resonance. He said, "It's the duty of the majority to leave no stone unturned, no means unused to conciliate the reasonable or unreasonable prejudice of the minority. Ireland can never be united, practically united, so long as there's this important minority who consider that the concession of legitimate freedom to Ireland means harm and damage to them, either to their spiritual or temporal interests. And until that's addressed, the work of building up an independent Ireland will have on it a fatal clog and a fatal drag." And I don't think that needs to mean appeasement or pandering or veto, but it will mean having the courage to answer difficult questions. To get it wrong risks forming an Ireland that's anything but united, and as Hume constantly reminded us, it is about uniting the people and not the territory, and whatever accelerant Brexit has put into the system, it has not united the people in any way. So for any scenario ahead of us, we need evolved, strong, practical north-south arrangements, and that's required to synchronise what are two very different economies, a very open economy in the south, a very closed economy in the south. We need those institutions to weather the Brexit storm, and we need those institutions, as I say, that were hard fought for, to give legitimate expression to those of us who wish to leave the United Kingdom. But both the Brexit campaign and the accelerated border poll campaign ignore the fact that there's no constitutional arrangement that makes your neighbours go away, or makes disagreements that you have with your neighbours going away. Just finishing up, Northern Ireland political dialogue feels Janus-faced. We always look to the past for justification of what we've done or we're doing, and we look to this unclear future to lead people along to. But we need political leadership in the here and now. People live in the here and now. People are trying to be educated in the here and now. People need health services in the here and now. And walking off the pitch while we look only to the past and to the future isn't acceptable. Unionism and nationalism are setting each other's teeth on edge at the moment, but we can't use that as an excuse. The phrase people are using, that Northern Ireland is ungovernable, somebody is going to be governing it in the medium term, and it's up to people in Northern Ireland to decide whether they want that governance to be in a way that reflects the principles of power sharing and that is accountable to them.